News and analysis of the day's global events with Basil Valentine on today's News Talk, TNT.
More than 200 Republican staffers who worked for former President George W. Bush, as well as Senators John McCain and Mitt Romney, have signed a letter endorsing Kamala Harris for President of the United States. The letter has been obtained and published by USA Today, and it reads in part, "Of course, we have plenty of honest, ideological disagreements with Vice President Harris and Governor Walz. That's to be expected. The alternative, however, is simply untenable. At home, another 4 years of Donald Trump's chaotic leadership, this time focused on advancing the dangerous goals of Project 2025, will hurt real everyday people and weaken our sacred institutions. Abroad, democratic movements will be irreparably jeopardized as Trump and his acolyte J.D. Vance kowtow to dictators like Vladimir Putin while turning their backs on our allies. We can't let that happen." I can't say I'm surprised to see this from former McCain and Romney staffers, two of the biggest rhinos, Republicans in name only, of recent years. Presidential election historian and commentator, all-round good egg, Rich Rubino. Do you think this is going to make any difference?
No, when you hear the word staffers, most people view them as kind of just the Byzantine part of the bureaucratic maze. Most people don't really, I don't think anyone's going to vote based on what a staffer from a previous administration or campaign did. But what they did is really in line. If you think about it, every Republican president or presidential nominee, with the possible exception of Barry Goldwater in 1964, you go back to Dwight Eisenhower in 52, all the way through Romney in 2012, they were all basically free traders. They all wanted more liberal laws for immigration, and they were all and they were all basically interventionist overseas. Donald Trump is I don't know if you call him a non-interventionist, certainly say for less intervention overseas. He's someone who says that he's opposed to the Iraq War and opposed to the war in Afghanistan. He's someone who's certainly an economic nationalist who supports the idea of protective tariffs. And he's the one that wants to curtail immigration, wants to curtail legal immigration and eliminate illegal immigration. So he is completely divergent ideologically from pretty much every Republican nominee from Eisenhower through Mitt Romney, with the possible exception of Goldwater.
Yeah, very good points. Tulsi Gabbard has come out this afternoon and endorsed Donald Trump, praising him and saying that during his first time, he exercised the courage that we expect from our commander-in-chief and exhausted all measures of diplomacy, having the courage to meet with adversaries, dictators, allies, and partners alike in the pursuit of peace. She looks at the world via a very different prism, obviously, than those former Republican staffers. It is interesting these days how you've got this dichotomy between people who want peace and therefore acknowledge that you have to speak to people like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. And then on the other hand, the Democratic Party, I mean, so misnamed these days, who not only want endless war, but have reclassified all forms of diplomacy as appeasement.
Well, I think in the case of Tulsi Gabbard, she's an interesting figure because she's somebody who grew up in the Democratic establishment, was elected to Congress from Hawaii, and was one of really the deputies of Nancy Pelosi. She's one of the assistants. She was one of the deputies, as a matter of fact, of the Democratic National Committee. She could very well have been on the trajectory to have become Speaker of the House at some point. When Bernie Sanders was running for president in 2016, she basically left her role at the DNC and endorsed Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders was running as kind of an anti-establishment maverick against Hillary Clinton, who was running more of an establishmentarian type candidacy. And since then, she ran for president in 2020, and she was kind of every Republican's favorite Democrat when she ran, because for one thing, she took on Vice President Harris during one of the debates. Her foreign policy views are probably closer to Bernie Sanders than they are to Hillary Clinton. But it's come to this point, though, in terms of this is where Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, at least on foreign policy and on trade policy, are very much connected. And I think that Tulsi Gabbard is kind of where right is kind of met left. lot of the rhetoric that you hear from Donald Trump was very similar, for example, of what you would have heard from Pat Buchanan when he ran in 92 and when he ran in 96. And a lot of what you're hearing from Tulsi Gabbard is similar to what the rhetoric you would have heard, for example, for Jerry Brown when he ran for president in 1992. This is really right and left. How do you do?
Yeah, very good points, all of them. I'm looking at a particularly impressive picture of Gabbard behind the podium there in a red jacket with Donald Trump mirroring her with a red tie. And they're standing on the podium of the National Guard Association of the United States. It's obvious they're not prepared to be outflanked by the Democrats in terms of patriotism, for all that Donald Trump wants to end the war, which of course in Ukraine, which of course Bobby Kennedy is actually cited as the number one reason why he defected to the Republican banner.
Yeah, well, Bobby Kennedy is also very much interesting. He's somebody that was seen as somebody who was part of the far left at one point. In 2004, he believed, for example, he's one of the few people in the Democratic Party who believed that there should be challenges in Ohio for against George W. Bush, that John Kerry actually won Ohio. He's gradually kind of come over,
which I believe he did.
John Kerry, yeah. That's certainly an argument you hear a lot. And there were a few Congress people, and eventually Barbara Boxer of California was the only member of the United States Senate that actually was willing to publicly state that that she believed Ohio was won by John Kerry. But so he's gradually come over to Donald Trump. I think that there are a lot of people in his family that are kind of mystified, if you will, by his kind of ideological divergence. But if you think about it, again, this is where right has met left. What you're listening to, what you heard from George W. Bush, for example, in the 2000s, the rhetoric about an interventionist foreign policy, about NATO, that is not that dissimilar from what you're hearing from Joe Biden and at least the center-left Democrats. So you really have this alliance right now, and it comes back to Robert F. Kennedy Jr., where you have Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on the one hand, and you have the libertarian kind of right wing and the non-interventionist Pat Buchanan right wing connecting. And then on the other side, you have the center-left Democratic Party of Joe Biden, the center-right Republican Party of Mitt Romney, John McCain, and George W. Bush, often working together as well. It's an interesting alliance. It's really center-right and center-left versus left and right.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's time for a complete realignment in politics, to be honest, about, basic things like censorship and operation of the media, war and peace. These are the things that really matter these days. And on those, as you say, you've got these unlikely bedfellows of so-called far left, so-called far right, with this warmongering neoliberal establishment posing as centrists. But in fact, in my view, they're the extremists, because as well as wanting World War III, they're also the ones most in favor of censorship.
Well, it's me that you brought up neoliberalism, because that's the part on the Democratic side, but it's also neoconservatism on the right wing. And they're basically refugees to the Republican Party. They began as Democrats. They actually go back to Trotsky, if you go back in their history. But they were Democrats who they supported every Democratic president, basically from Franklin Roosevelt through Lyndon Johnson. They were after they went all the way with LBJ in 64. In 68, there was kind of a breakup in the party. On the one hand, you had folks who supported Eugene McCarthy, who was an anti-war candidate. On the other hand, you had those more establishment Democrats, neoconservatives, if you will, who supported Hubert Humphrey. And then after 68, basically the anti-war Democrats won. And then in 1972, South Dakota Senator George McGovern landed up winning the nomination. And a lot of those neoconservatives, this is when they began, because George McGovern was somebody who very much supported a withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam, began to matriculate over to the Republican Party. In 76, in the 1976 Democratic primaries, they supported a senator from Washington named Henry Scoop Jackson. And he was very much an interventionist in the basically Roosevelt through Johnson foreign policy. He lost to Jimmy Carter, and they gradually started, more and more of them became Republicans. And then Ronald Reagan, one thing with the Reagan coalition, he brought in two groups of people that were former Democrats. He brought in neoconservatives on the one hand for foreign policy conservatives, and he brought in Christian conservatives, many of whom had supported Jimmy Carter, a fellow Southern Baptist and a Sunday school teacher, They had supported him in 76. They believed he was they started to deviate from him ideologically, and they both came into the Republican Party. And where does this come in now? Well, now you're seeing the neoliberal influence on the Democratic Party, and now you're seeing interventionists in terms of the Democratic Party, to the point that at the convention, the last day of the convention, before Vice President Harris spoke, you had folks like Leon Panetta, the former defense secretary in the Obama administration, going up there and giving a speech about the vicissitudes of and how great he thought that NATO was. You had Mark Kelly, the senator from Arizona, doing very much the same. So now you have neoconservative, neoliberal alliance in the Democratic and the Republican Party, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, I can't help thinking that both Tulsi Gabbard and Robert Kennedy could be big assets to Trump. They both appeared on the podium with him already. Do you expect to see Tulsi and Bobby touring the country with, both J.D. Vance and the Donald in the weeks ahead, doing sort of double acts or appearing regularly on the stump for Trump? Or do you think that, post these endorsements, absent the occasional TV appearance, that's it, and we're not going to hear much more from them?
I think you'll probably see less of Robert Kennedy Jr. being directly with Trump. Tulsi Gabbard's a different story, though, because Tulsi Gabbard is someone that, frankly, even though she's had a history of a Democrat, she's somebody that can really galvanize support on the right. It's always apropos for a political party to bring over somebody from the other side, and that person will come over and they'll say something to the effect of, I did not leave the Democratic Party, or I did not leave the Republican Party. That party left me. Jean Kirkpatrick.
Yes.
Yes, Jean
exactly.
Kirkpatrick. Yeah. For example, it's great if you're trying to sell your political ideology to someone. Say, this person used to believe the opposite. Now this person has come over to my side, and that person will go out and campaign for the new candidate. It's always politically beneficial.
Well, I would have thought on the issue of war and peace, arguably the most important position in the world, that there are a lot of Democrats who are unhappy with their party's position, but they're certainly not the mega donors, because Harris has raised $540 million in July. This is a really eye-watering sum. I think everybody's surprised at that amount. I said at the top of the program, I feel sorry for American television viewers. They're going to have to sit through wall-to-wall Harris adverts in the weeks ahead.
Well, that's only in, you know what, though, what the interesting part of that, though, is that's really only in 10 states that you see them. We have this system called the Electoral College, where essentially 40 states are in the electoral sidelines. So at Canada will go to a place like Los Angeles or New York City, they'll raise money, then they'll spend that money to basically run as like they're running for governor of a state like Wisconsin or Michigan or Pennsylvania. So most Americans are really not seeing any political advertisements. Sometimes there's some overlap. For example, the Boston TV market, because New Hampshire is somewhat of a swing state, you get it in Boston. You might get some overlap in Alabama because they're near Florida, they're near Georgia. But generally speaking, we're at a point in American politics where where basically 10 states are deciding the election, the other 40 states are sitting on the electoral sidelines watching.
Makes it even worse if you happen to be in one of those states.
Oh, yes. Yes. Oh, absolutely. If you live in Wisconsin, you do not turn your TV on. All you're going to be hearing about is Harris and Trump.
Trump says he'd rather have the microphones muted during the upcoming debate with Harris. First of all, is it still only going to be one debate? And is it going to really make any difference?
They're still talking about that. I think it will make a difference, because Trump needs to do something to blunt Vice President Harris's momentum. She did get the convention bound because she had the last convention, and usually the party that holds the last convention will get that bounce. He needs to do something to blunt that bounce. George H.W. Bush in 1988 was down by 17 points to the caucus. In the summer of 1988, after the caucus's convention, he came back and landed up winning 40 states and 55% of the vote. Trump needs something like that as well.
And finally, Rich, is your $10 still going on Trump to be inaugurated in January?
No, I would right now, if you absolutely had to beg me to do it, I would say this: Jill Stein is not going to win.
But okay, that's the only bet. That's the only prediction you're willing to make.
That's the only. This is such a close election. I really don't know, but I would say that Jill Stein, Chase Oliver, and Cornel West are probably going to lose this election. I put my money on that.
Okay, fair enough, Rich Rubino. Thanks so much for joining us once again on today's News Talk. I'll be back same time.